Okay, recording in progress. Let me do one thing, is reduce brightness. And I think we're on.
Good.
Yes. So for the audience, we have a change of scenery. We are recording in Pactum office in Tallinn. And as is apparently maybe, but Janne and I, we both work in Pactum in different roles.
Yeah.
Janne, do you want to make the introduction of yourself?
Certainly. So I'm Janne. I'm a designer and the only designer at Pactum at the moment, looking after all of our products, excluding marketing side of things. I've been working in the UX for a number of years before UX was even a thing. Back in the day, most of the work was done under the umbrella of usability and human-computer interaction, and interaction design started to be a thing when I started my career. And eventually I then moved to the UX.
What year was it, more or less, when you started your career?
Around 2005 or so. And that was when I was doing my master's thesis for Nokia Research Center, and then continued to work with the Nokia. And I was involved in their usability team, which was highly academic, and then moved to the business units to work on the Nokia phones.
So apparently it means you're Finnish.
I am Finnish, yes. And from Helsinki area.
Is this correct to say that your career journey was after Nokia you joined Microsoft?
Yeah. Essentially what happened was that Microsoft bought the Nokia's smartphone business, and they bought me at the same time. And that's how I transferred to Microsoft Finland. Microsoft eventually escaped the mobile phone businesses and wanted to concentrate their people on the Redmond sites. So after they fired everybody from Finland, they noticed that, okay, they want to have me in the Redmond and offered me a ticket to US. So from Microsoft smartphones, I shifted to Microsoft Redmond, working on the Photos team.
Photos team.
Yeah, originally continuing with the camera work that I was doing with Nokia. As that took less of priority, then it turned to a Photos application. We did some video editing applications. Then I started to play with the operating system itself. So I was in a number of projects on Windows 10 and the early phases of what became Windows 11. That lasted for a while, but eventually Google called me and asked me whether I want to work with their stuff and the data centers. And yeah, I said, yeah, sure. So then I spent a couple of years in California.
Oh, you actually lived there?
Yeah. Altogether, I think it was about 5 years. First in Redmond, then in Bay Area. And then my wife basically got enough of that, so I wanted to move back to Finland. So I moved back to Finland and did some consulting first in a consulting agency called Nitor. Then wanted to play around with robots, so I joined Starship for a while and then came to Pactum to work with the AI.
Got it. Yeah, what do you think, I'm just curious still on your background, what were pivotal moments in your career, or even starting with education or career, things that affected your kind of view and beliefs and experience in design the most? You feel, what were these keystone moments for you?
I think the biggest impact eventually came later. Like, I wasn't really planning to be a designer. I was planning to do cool stuff. And I got out of the high school, I wanted to do robots and blinking lights. And turns out that electrical engineering is not all that fun. So I joined the art school and did double masters, first in the engineering school because it was too late to change, and then on the art school. But already back then I was doing movie/animation related topics like computer graphics, what have you. In the engineering school, which is mostly then software heavy, and that translated to the art studies on interactive movie making, interactive media. So it wasn't intentional. It just happened to align then with the design. And that's how I got my initial gigs at Nokia as well. Like, mostly about it wasn't really a design job. It's more like exploring and research sense that what could browsers be on mobile phone. And because the usability was so heavily emphasized in a team, I could connect it to the usability people, and that then shifted me towards design. One day, a colleague of mine was just talking, hey, there's this new thing called interaction design, and he wanted to be that. So I then figured, okay, what is this thing? And I started to like see whether I have jobs in it. And seems like people at least believed so. So I got a couple of chances and then moved to the design side of things. So I think there wasn't like one single moment when things changed. It was more like the stars were aligning and leading me that way. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. As said, back then there was no real software design education even anywhere.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
There was usability, which is slightly different.
Yeah, even 10 years ago, I did master level courses on where it already started to appear human-computer interaction.
Yeah.
But I think 20 years ago there was like barely anything.
And human-computer interaction did exist, but it wasn't really about design per se as we understand it today. It was more like, how do we make something usable and how should people interact with the things? Not really like, hey, what should this thing be?
Yes. Yeah. So, but which topics would you like to explore today? So.
I have a plenty. Like, I think one of the major ones is like, what are the major misconceptions about design and UX?
In the industry as a whole, in the IT tech industry.
Yeah, I would say as a whole, at least from my perspective. And there are like caricature versions of it, and I don't really want to explore them too much. Like a concrete example, especially in the design circles, it's often like portrayed that designers are just asked to put some nice pixels on the screen and that's it. Everybody knows about that. So that's not really interesting to me anymore. Because while that's still the case at times, it's a little bit on the surface level, and these guys have probably heard it a million times before.
But yes, let's start with that discussion. So what would you like personally to highlight in that regard? Like, what are the most common misunderstandings about UX?
I think the biggest ones come from the practical level. Like oftentimes people don't really know what the design does, and often it's working with the PMs or other key people in the company on setting on the roadmaps and the future vision where we want to go. How that happens shifts from company to company, and everyone in design is more involved and everyone is not. But once we get to more practical level, a misconception I think people are having is really about how to make the trade-offs on what is in the product and what is usable and what is not. Most people, even myself included every now and then, reflect upon on themselves that what is usable and what is not. That may or may not match what the actual end users are thinking about it. And that then leads to the problem that when we have teams who are asked to do a feature, everybody in that team is incentivized to make that feature the best it can be. However, if we basically look at the product as a whole, not every feature can be the star of the show. Some of the things are supporting features, and if we need to sacrifice some of those for the sake of the more important ones. And oftentimes this tends to be forgotten for practical reasons. People have and teams have incentive to do the best they can with one particular feature. Product often has like incentive to make a feature shine because fame and glory. But in the big picture, it may be better to do features which are less usable, as funny as it sounds.
It's, I think, less usable. I'll have like questions about it. I think you want to make it usable, but I think good example is maybe you want to be it in the place where it's not maybe as you said, like I want to just reflect on it. Yeah, what can happen is that by building just being a feature factory and just building many different features, you will lose the sense of what your product should feel like and be experienced like as a whole. And then you end up in this Frankenstein of a lot of features built on top of each other, and then it really hurts the whole usability of the whole product, right? But the feature in and of itself, each feature should be usable, but it should be put into its correct context and place, and maybe even hidden and only be revealed when it actually you intended to use it.
That's true, and I was somewhat imprecise. Like discoverability, usability doesn't mean that it's discoverable per se. And a lot of times hiding something can hinder the discoverability, but not necessarily usability. But for the lack of shorthand, I'm clumping some things together. But you're right. And oftentimes it is thus understandable that everybody puts their feature or whatever the thing is that they are doing on the front stage. And when everybody tries to do that, everything is on the front stage. And then nothing is anymore in focus because everybody tries to be.
So what's the antidote for that?
Strong discipline and a strong understanding on what really is important.
Understanding by the team, right? Shared alignment in the team by that.
At least by the team, probably by the organization, depending a little bit on how you are structuring. Like if the team is really responsible for the whole product or just a subset of the products. Again, it depends on the size of the whole thing.
And how do you see here how each one in the team should play their role correctly, or if I can use this word correctly, or as best as they could to have the cohesive, usable product versus just conglomeration of features? How do you think engineers should behave, and which discipline or principles they should have, and designers and PMs? And then how the next question would be how different roles here should collaborate with each other to make sure this is the case.
That's
like practically talking about it.
Yeah,
in a team setting.
That's an open, wide question. I'm wondering where to start, like unraveling that.
Let's start with engineers, because you probably have a lot of critique to engineers on how it should work. In a sense, what do you think? Which principles engineers should follow to avoid this state of just conglomerating features on top of each other?
I do want to rephrase that question a little bit, because I think it's perhaps easier to think about the ideal ways of operating inside the products.
Let's
because that if you basically start to unravel that one, a lot of that deals with how do the different roles work together to create the products. This is also a difficult discussion because there are different products, different companies which operate in different fields. So nothing is really universal. For the sake of audience, let's imagine that we are in the consumer space, because it's a little bit easier to relate to that.
Business to customer.
Let's imagine we have a big company who's making some iPhone application and wanting to do something, but doesn't really matter. Over there, there's also a difference whether we are actually doing a new product or we are expanding an existing product. I'm taking the approach of talking about a new product.
Okay.
So some things may change a little bit while we are working in an established field, but essentially the gist of the whole process, in my view, ought to be the same. And initially, I would imagine that the whole work starts by an idea or hypothesis or something that you want to test out that, hey, I believe this kind of application would make sense. You collect a small, diverse team of people on figuring out whether this is true or what would that manifest in. Ideally, I would imagine that there would be some sort of user research and design. Somebody from engineering, probably the lead engineer. Probably a product manager, depending a little bit on the company and how the skill sets otherwise align. And they start to create the fastest way of creating a hypothesis on how you can prove that this application is successful, whatever the criteria of successful is. Often means money and scale and whatnot, but not always. Those start to test the hypothesis as fast as possible, probably initially collecting research on what has been done before and how that's working, how people are using similar application and what is wrong with the competition and so forth. and everybody shares that information and does it together.
I think this is a crucial point. Everyone shares this information and does it together because each one will have a different angle on processing this information and making the next assumptions or next ideas. But it's important that the whole team shares this information and has this shared pool of things, and then each one can contribute effectively. And that's where innovation happens, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important point that you brought.
And yes, there is expertise here and there, but it doesn't mean that people cannot participate in that. And oftentimes it is even better that people participate on stuff, even if it's not fully perfect, just to get this alignment coming in. And so that's where it basically starts. The second point is that for practical reasons, this team needs to be relatively small. You cannot do that with 200 people, and 200 people basically just leads that you have so much input that you can spend all your time on collecting that so that you don't really make a progress.
What is small team in your opinion?
We are talking about
range of small team.
Less than 10, and probably something 4-ish initially.
Pizza size of the team.
Roughly speaking. If you have a lot more, then you're risking that people are not really doing anything and just like getting frustrated. If you have too few, then you might feel like you're excluding people. So you play it by ear a little bit, what you can manage. Eventually you get to the point where you have a hypothesis, or you have like Amazon at least used to do, I think they still do, like product briefs, like a PR release on what people would write once this gets launched on the launch day. Ultimately, if you go abstract, what they're doing is that they are trying to describe the outcome of the whole thing. Whether if that is a press release or if that's an internal document, doesn't really matter, but you have some sort of like understanding of what you're trying to do. So, and then you can basically start to figure out that one of the important lessons I learned is that what is the fastest way of showing that you are wrong? Because if you try to prove something, it's really hard. But if you try to say that this is wrong, it's a lot easier. But if you cannot do that, eventually you end up with the products. Because, hey, it didn't seem that it's wrong, so let's try it out for real. So that leads to an immediate prototyping phase. Again, you were asking that how should designers work with the engineering? Well, now you have a prototyping teams who together figure out what is the fastest way of like making the next logical step in the application development. So, well, they work together like, hey, let's start making it and see where it fails, what it should be. It may be that designer is drawing some wireframes and showing them to the users. It may be that the engineering is hacking up some logical demo where the technology works, or mixing those two together. Who knows? But what is the fastest way of like disproving the hypothesis? Eventually that gets higher and higher and higher fidelity. And
pretty much fail fast.
And if you don't fail fast, then hey, good news. Then you can scale it up. Same goes with the previous question about team sizing, that eventually you will need more and more people to increase the fidelity level, and that's where the team starts to grow. So essentially that process itself kind of like, I believe, describes how designers and engineers ought to work together, as well as the other disciplines.
So pretty much have very quick end-to-end iteration cycles to quickly form hypothesis, a high-quality hypothesis as fast as possible, but it should be informed hypothesis, right? Based on certain research or, well, some bets you make. Or maybe not, I don't know, it could be some crazy things that you just want to test out, right? Like, I don't know, let's just make this thing red, or like some crazy things. But if you can test it out very quickly enough and it's inexpensive, then you might just go as well as and do it. But you do hypothesis, you do end-to-end iterations as a whole team. And either you fail fast or you actually find something valuable and you kind of leverage that and learn from it and be like, okay, maybe actually there's something here, there's some traction, and we want to kind of explore it more.
And for that to happen, you essentially just need to have a clear boundaries where the team is operating, or problem that they are trying to solve, so that they don't go too wild.
So some focus, right?
However that is expressed. But
so let's say like this, the solution space, it can be very wide, but the problem space should be limited.
So that
which problem space the team is operating.
Of course, you can challenge that.
Yes.
But if you just go too wild, then the team does whatever or doesn't
I
know
agree.
what to do.
You should focus on solving a specific problem, and then of course you can go wild with solutions, but the focus on the problem should be there. The laser focus on solving this particular problem.
And what also like that helps is that you have some sort of metrics, like whatever the goal is, like user acceptance criteria, scaling, money generation, whatever it is. The point of that one is essentially that we have somewhat shared belief on what is good. Because if you're just asking what kind of product is good, I don't know. Like it depends on circumstances. But if you have a metrics that you try to improve, at least it's somewhat open to like somewhat shared knowledge on.
But sometimes these metrics are kind of a lag measure, right? You will not be able to see any improvements in this metric until you actually launch something, or until you actually, you could say, scale it. So you need, I would say like this, you need lead metrics and lag metrics.
Yeah,
right?
depending on,
you need something that will give you a signal, what are you doing now? Is it like moving you closer? To eventually those lag measures. But
just a concrete example, we could imagine that we are creating some baby care application for parents. He can say that the concept needs to be daily use by 80% of the parents. And yes, sure, it is kind of lagging, but you can approximate that early on. By doing surveys, you can show it to the number of sample users. Yes, it's not fully accurate, but it's kind of like thereabouts nonetheless. So even if somebody feels like it's a lagging measure, you can be creative about it.
Yeah, I agree. All right, and I want to still double down on this question. I know we're exploring it in depth, but I think it's interesting. What I found, I just want to reflect on my own experience on working effectively with designers or even in the team to iterate fast. What I found out works really well is when, I think I learned this technique in when studying human-computer interaction. We actually had a class called Interaction Design, but what we learned there is to very quickly do low-fidelity prototypes as a team, to have a shared understanding. Do we even agree on the whole interaction, how this thing should work end to end? And by simply drawing boxes, and literally you can do it even on paper. That's why it's called paper prototyping. But of course nowadays there are many tools that pretty much convert the paper prototyping to, to digital format. But still, it's pretty much drawing boxes, right? Very low fidelity wireframes, just to agree on the main key points of the interactions. This is where the button is going to be. This is what happens when I click it. These are the next kind of, this is like to agree on the flow. And even that sometimes is so challenging, right? But what it taught me is that it's much less expensive, like to do this exercise rather than to first build the high fidelity prototype or even actually the real thing, just for the team to realize, oh, wait a minute, we are not aligned on this whole thing. And then PM and engineers or designers will be like, no, I think it should work the other way. I think actually when you click the button, we should show this, not that. But having the low fidelity prototype really, how should I say, like makes the feedback loop much faster to align in the team.
As a concrete example, when I was working with the Microsoft and the Photos team, we were planning a new mobile application. I'm leaving out the details for it, but stuff. We were able to do a lo-fi drawing prototype that ran on the phone in a matter of hours. So what we did on the beginning of the week, that we created the prototype, we started to show it to the people in the afternoon. The next morning, we did an improvement version, repeated the cycle for 1 week. And then basically
without building the whole thing, right?
We are basically just drawing on the paper and scanning those and creating a prototype out of that. Fair enough, it was a small application, so it was possible, but in theory you can do this for the features. And after that, it is not proof, but it is kind of like stronger opinion that, okay, this is how it ought to work, and this is where the value of the application is. So yes, again, it's kind of like hard to say anything universal, but it often works. When it comes to low fidelity, just an anecdotally, to give a counter example, many of the larger companies have so strong visual libraries. You can actually throw out high fidelity mock-up in the
Cheaply. Cheaply, yeah.
in the same time that you do the lo-fi. So things can change, but nonetheless the point stands.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Here at Paxum, we are kind of like in the same position that we have a pretty strong library for the stuff that we do. So we don't really need to do low fidelity for everything because we already have the components.
Yeah, and the components, I mean, we have them, for example, in Figma, right?
Yeah.
Or we are still building it, I know, and I think I can share that. We are starting to have these reusable components in Storybook. We use Storybook for engineers, but I would say we still need to align. How do we align the what we have in Figma with what we have in Storybook, and still to have this shared, growing shared components also in the Storybook, which is actually usable by engineers immediately. But at least by having them in Figma, right, it helps a lot.
And that also like touches the second point that when we were at Nokia doing the camera, one of the engineers was so fast making changes that we didn't have any point doing the wireframe prototypes.
Yes.
Because he was just so fast.
Yes. So essentially, in the end, it comes down to fast feedback loops and learning fast as a team. Well, and you can have feedback loops both internally in the team to align, but also then externally, right? If you want to actually show and test it in the users, the main point is to make the iteration as fast as possible. And whether you use low fidelity, high fidelity, or an actual product, this will already depend on the context, how fast you can make the change, right?
Yes, that's precisely it.
Yeah, makes sense. I have a question about Figma, because I think it's going to be interesting for engineers who are listening to the podcast, maybe not only engineers, but if, let's say, a company has a high fidelity or the good level of components and everything ready in Figma, would you say it's a good investment of engineering time to learn Figma and get to use it very well, so that they can also exercise, prototyping in Figma versus, let's say, very low fidelity, just like drawing boxes? Do you think that's something that would be valuable for organizations if engineers learn about it or not?
It depends on the organization, and there's nothing wrong for using Figma for that. I haven't seen a great benefit from being an expert in Figma per se if you're doing engineering work. If you want to do that work, sure. There are many others, but sure. Where the problem is that the components don't really make the applications. And you can basically throw together whatever you want. Looks approximately right, but it doesn't guarantee anything.
Yes.
So,
yeah, it's more again like using Figma for still low fidelity prototyping, but just if you have a shared components, you can easily kind of just for a very quick feedback, ask PM or even designer, is this somehow, how do you think it should look like, or just to bounce ideas around?
Doesn't hurt. It's basically the trade-off, how much time you want to spend on it. I can't say it, but I would assume that if it takes a lot of your time, then it's probably not worth it.
Yeah. That's why I'm still doing it in Excalibur. If you know, this is just like pretty much drawing boxes. And for me, it's been good enough. But
yeah, on that note, I was surprised how cheap our Figma licenses are. So in that sense, it also doesn't hurt. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So what other UX misunderstandings people have?
Let me see where we left off. I guess I'm mostly about the process, heavily on the process myself, because I believe that's where the root problems are. But another topic that perhaps we could talk about is the concept of good. Now I may be projecting myself too much, and like I think there's like therapy session over here.
No, it's good. And I have a saying, perfect is the enemy of good, So let's define what is good. Yes.
Yeah, I've been like wondering that we often say that, okay, the product needs to be good or the design needs to be good.
What does it actually mean?
Yeah, and who gets to decide what is good? Especially if you don't have a client feedback. In some ways, larger companies, let's say Microsoft, has the problem that there's so much feedback that you can't basically act on it.
Okay.
You have 4 million people giving you feedback, so how do you find out what you should do? even more so if you basically want to have something that's opinionated and not just like averaging out the results. Then you need
Which
to
could
have,
be worse, actually, right? Averaging
Yeah.
out results.
yeah,
Because then you build something average which no one is happy with.
yeah. And then again, if you go to the other route and say that, okay, well, I don't care about the statistics, I'm going to do what I think is right, that's pretty risky as well. So it's an interesting problem on itself. But then there's also the underlying factors that like, what are you actually capable of producing and how much effort you are wanting to put into that. Because actually polishing stuff out is pretty expensive in means of time. And for example, in the startups, do you really want to like spend an hour on, well, not an hour, a month per feature just to polish the visuals when
You'll be dead by that
Yeah.
time as a startup.
But many of the larger companies do that. So are you really like going after that?
Yeah, okay.
And do you want to go after that?
So the real question is, how does a company align on what is good and what's
Yeah.
their quality?
And what is like sufficient? Even Apple makes trade-offs like what is good. And their trade-offs may be different than their startup, but they do nonetheless.
I think it's a good topic to explore, yes, and sorry, I'm interrupting,
Yeah,
but I'm just
please
saying
do.
I'm
Please do.
very keen to, yes, hear your opinions on that, because I think there's been many misconceptions in the industry. By the way, there is the same discussion, which we will not explore today, but in engineering, what is good in engineering? And I explored it with Anton Keks in the previous episode, in one of the episodes before. And there's this whole idea of under-engineering versus over-engineering, and actually where you hit the trade-off. And this is some really important questions, like which are really critical. Like, what do we define good in the team, and aligned understanding of good in engineering? But yes, in terms of product, then how does a company and a team, respectively, can get this shared understanding of what is good? And what is good, actually, in your opinion?
That's actually something that I've been like struggling with. Like at some point, rather early on in my career, when web was kind of like even more crude than it is now, I started to wonder that why do people use Craigslist?
Use what?
Craigslist. It's essentially a website where you can basically sell services, buy, use stuff, connect to people, and what have you.
Okay.
Especially in the US. It looks absolutely awful. There's no like nice way to put it. It is successful nonetheless. If we take the UX/design approach, is that good design or not? I could argue that it is, because it basically is successful, it does what it's supposed to be, it sets the expectations right.
It's usable because people use it, and very successful, right?
It is awful, it has problems, but nonetheless, if you try to make it better, it doesn't really like necessarily lead to any better performance or even happiness to the people.
Yeah.
There was also a discussion on SIGHI Finland not too long ago, where we had an example of a taxi driver who had 6 screens on the car. Whatever the central control system was, then you have the screen behind the wheel. Then you had, I'm not sure what the screen was, but that was probably for navigation. Another one for taking Uber calls and whatnot, and a couple of phones.
Yeah.
And there was a discussion, okay, this is insane. On some level it is, but the driver had chosen that.
Yes.
So who are we to say that it should be different? Because they basically put them together.
Yes.
And if you try to like put our morals into how they are working, especially so when it leads to trade-offs on our implementation, it becomes a thorny problem. Like, I don't have an answer to that. And I think that that's something that every company and every team needs to figure out themselves to at least some extent. So what is good? And in many cases, what is good gets set early on. Like, for example, over here, we have some baseline that we are selling to clients. We can't really go below that. We can go above it. But when we are a startup, are we willing to pay for it? That's a big question.
I think it comes down right to the all the way down to the core values of the company and
Yeah.
principles and philosophy of how it operates. For example, Apple, they definitely, we can start to talk about Apple, right? Which is, Apple has this minimum bar of quality, which everyone expects of it, almost like learned to expect of it.
Yeah.
And they won't deliver anything, or at least in their own heads, not deliver anything less than quality. They would rather postpone this or like not do it if they, but they will not deliver it until it like is the quality that users expect, right?
Yes.
This was just designed all the way from the leadership of the company.
Yes.
So in a sense, leadership decides what is good and then propagates to the whole decision making of the whole company.
Yeah. Now that's one way of doing that. Google has a kind of different approach.
Okay.
That is more like metrics driven.
Okay.
And so then the teams are more. It's not that you don't have top down, but it's more like you have metrics and that you can basically use to justify that, okay, this does what we were expecting it to do.
So in a sense, you agree with the leadership on metrics, or what are the, let's say, key performance indicators, right? Or what are the key metrics that you kind of, report on, let's say, or people kind of measure your success against those metrics. And then you as a team can decide what is good in the sense of product or other things to support achieving these metrics.
Yeah, and it depends really on the team itself and the company, that how it gets structured. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying that there are different approaches to it. Another example where when I was working at the Microsoft, again, I'll leave the precise team unnamed for now, but there was a very heavy culture on exploring what works and what doesn't. And it just happened that an engineer decided to release a button that was blue against completely black background. Surprise, surprise, the engagement metrics went rocketing because you have black screen and then there's a blue bright button. What do people do? They press the button.
Yes. Even though it might have on the first glance looked ugly, right? From the designer perspective.
Maybe. And again, we come back down to the bigger picture that, okay, is this what we want to do? So there needs to be some like higher level discussion on boundaries where you are operating. And that's always there. So, well, always? I have a hard time figuring out any company that would operate strictly on metrics alone, but I guess that's possible too. So usually there's also a mixture of these aspects.
Yes. I agree. And it all comes down to values. For example, I'll give you an example of Wise. I worked in Wise, TransferWise, now Wise. It was extremely important even from the company value perspective that we are always very transparent on fees. So pretty much it was banned in the company to hide the fees in the UI or UX. It was a given that you have to have a very clear understanding of the fees, and you don't use any dark patterns or any dark UX patterns there. Like it was, I mean, if someone would use it, probably they would be fired from the company right away or given a last warning, before, but no one of course did. And everyone believed that, yes, it's very important to have that. But this again, for me, comes down to, as you said, it all depends on the context and on what values or constraints the leadership propagates down.
Yeah, and especially when you're in a startup or in a small company that is growing. Once you are bigger, things change a little bit because then you have time to explore. Like, for example, what happens if you hide the feeds? Well, the feeds is slightly trickier topic because that like
in Wise it would never happen. They would never hide the fees.
Dark patterns is a theme. They
let's talk about Ryanair.
So they kind of work, but do you want to go there?
Yeah. Do you want to go there? And again, it's a leadership question. Right?
Yeah.
Do we want to go there?
And as an individual contributor, your choices are pretty much to leave if you don't agree with that one. So there's no hiding that. So
cool. No, that was so. But to conclude the topic of what is good, or would you want to add something else? But my reflection on this would be, it depends on each company. It always comes in the context. What do you want to improve, or what things you want to drive? Sometimes it's metric driven. Sometimes it's purely value driven, or philosophy driven, or principles driven. Like leadership just makes a choice. We want to be like that. Like in case of Apple. Maybe Airbnb is a good example.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, they started with a philosophy that we want the user experience to be very good.
Yeah.
And you could feel from the product they had a certain level of standard by using it over the years that the UX was at a certain level and they never went below that. I think, at least from my very subjective experiential point of view of using Airbnb for a while, it's always been like that. But it depends on the company. For example, I think the good example is even, are you reading or have you seen the Hacker News website?
I haven't.
So it's just like Hacker News, it's a website where people publish different kind of news, but they're mostly like for the IT industry, mostly engineers or the target audience reading that, sometimes designers, people in startup community as well, as target audience. But the idea is that their website is super minimalistic. It's literally like the website from 2000s, which just has the upvote, downvote, topic, and literally the design is, I think it's all in HTML and CSS, but like nothing fancy, no fancy things, but it's so usable. Like I love it. When I read it on the phone, it doesn't have any noise. It loads very fast. It's amazing, and it does what it's supposed to do, and I love it. And for me, this is a good example where they decided this is good, and we want it to be like experienced like that. We are prioritizing fast website without any bells and whistles, minimalism, and this was a design choice from the start. And they pretty much haven't changed this design, like never, and it's perfect. I love it.
And if it's working, then who are we to say that it should be different? It might hurt me, but who am I to say anything about it because it's working? I think another aspect about that one is that it's pretty hard, but it would be helpful if the company is transparent what the definition of good is.
Yes, and it's somewhere even written it down, right? Writing it down, not only being in the heads of people.
Obviously, the environment itself kind of like encourages itself and crafts what is good. But for people who are like wondering, it is good to read it down from somewhere and understand, okay, this is what we are aiming for and this is what we are doing. So if you're doing something wildly different, you're just wasting time. I guess one of my concerns is not really about time wasting per se, but also reducing unneeded conflicts. I don't like adversarial roles. I believe that people work together better. And if they just communicate better and are on the same page, things go smoothly and everybody gets to be creative and whatnot. In some sense, structure and hierarchy often helps that in funny ways, because then people don't need to like justify their roles because they already have the authority and then they are open to collaborate more. But again, it depends on people and how they work. The point being that if we basically have like internal beliefs on what we strive for, what is good, then it should be available for everybody.
Available, you mean to read, or available? In what sense available?
In sense that we don't need to discuss that if we should update the Hacker News UI to be fancy and whatnot, because we understand that, okay, this is what we strive for.
So the strong shared alignment is important. I agree. And by the way, same as in engineering. Again, I'm drawing parallels, I know, but honestly, same in engineering. When people align on values and principles in engineering, starting from the leadership, then going down to the teams, it's so much more enjoyable to work and better to work. And because it does drive all the subsequent tactical decisions, they are decided and dictated by this more strategic and kind of the alignment on principles and values. And I think in design it's the same, right? Once the company aligns on some of the core values and principles, how it operates and what is good, then it kind of propagates. Then each member in the company can decide on the tactical decisions through the lens of that vision and alignment.
And it's surprisingly difficult to actually do that. Like, especially in design land, principles are not heard of. It's very common actually, but having good principles is pretty rare.
But can we talk about it? Like, how would the company, starting from small startups, but then growing, let's say Pactum is late stage startup, right? We are already, 100 people, around 100 people in the company, more or less. I don't know the exact number, but I believe that's
thereabouts.
how would you say companies like that should align, or what's your advice to align on the design principles and values?
In Pactum,
Or UX design.
In Pactum, since I'm more or less the only designer, it's
Yeah.
Obviously we have different stakeholders, and we have company founders and who knows
Yes.
who are basically leading the whole thing. But when it comes on the tactical design stuff, it's pretty easy because I'm just basically checking out that everything is working more or less the same way inside the Pactum environments. If you want to change, that's fine too, but then everything needs to change and follow more or less the same design language that we have developed. I think that's more or less the case from the early startups. Things change once you get bigger. What is bigger?
500 people, for example, in the company.
Yeah, thereabouts. The design organization might be relatively small still, but at some point you start to hit that. But you need to have enough people who can spend time on creating these values as well. When that comes, probably when it starts to be a problem. The tricky part is how to make them good. Because oftentimes when people come together and figure out values, they are too high-flying, like hacking the whole world and trying to save the whole company, and that's not like practical.
Yes.
And in my opinion, good values always pose trade-offs, like do this, not that.
That help you make, in the end, decisions, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's about making decisions that align with those values.
Yeah.
And they should inform you to make those decisions in some way.
Yeah, like a concrete bad example that I've seen in various forms too often is that, okay, everything needs to be usable.
Yeah. Not very useful. Not very useful, right?
Yeah, like whoever designs anything that's not usable, like nobody does that intentionally.
Yeah.
So what's the point of value? You can basically throw it out because there's no trade-off. But if there is, for example, that, okay, we value speed over visuals, then you make trade-offs based on that.
Like Google did with their search main
For
page,
example,
right? The speed was paramount.
Yeah, and
They stripped everything else down. Versus Yahoo, which didn't do that, for example.
Yeah. And whether those are right or wrong is a separate discussion, but the value itself basically forces you to make some trade-offs. Or, like you said, facilitate decision-making and alignments.
Okay. Yeah. What we were talking about. I'm trying to understand. Let's backtrack. Well, we're wrapping out the discussion about what is good. And then, well, we actually started to talk about alignment of values and principles in the team, right? That was the topic. You said it's not a big problem in small organizations. It becomes a little bit bigger in bigger organizations.
Yeah.
How do you think, again, how would you propagate or how would you communicate these values throughout the whole company? Because suddenly, would it be correct to say that suddenly you don't control all these decisions in the teams, right? You don't have control over that. You just can be almost like an evangelist or just propagate it through communication. But at the end of the day, teams can make their own decisions, and you won't have capacity to kind of police every team and say, like, do this, don't do that, change this button. It's impossible, right? But you have to make sure, how do you distribute those values effectively to the teams so that they make high quality decisions that align with at least what you as a designer, or let's say chief designer in the team, in the company, thinks about, or how would you say it like that? That this is important for bigger teams?
Yes.
Bigger companies?
What do you think about the question? Are you talking about the company or the design per se? Those operate slightly differently, but there are similarities.
I'm curious about, let's say, imagine it's a bigger company now, like 200 people plus, and you don't have capacity as the chief designer to kind of check the work of every team and give them individual feedback. Maybe. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But imagine you are at the stage where you understand that, well, you want to propagate certain principles, design principles, UX principles in the whole company. How do you do that?
Essentially, that's by challenging your assumption that I don't have the time. So you make the time, and you are looking through what is coming out so that the principles are followed.
Okay, but if I'm the new, let's say, engineer in the team, I just joined. What materials ideally I would have to understand or get the values and principles that are in your mind, so that I would at least understand your point of view, and ideally align my decision making with how you think about design and what values and principles you have. Would you write a document, one document, or would it be?
You probably would have a wiki page where that's listed out.
Okay, so that's you would say that's important to have something written down.
Yeah, and it's not just the design stuff, but basically all the gatekeepers who are making the decision whether this goes out or not. If you have an individual party that basically says no, we can't ship this, that's usually hard to like maintain. Like a case of Facebook and moderation teams, and to my knowledge and recollection, which may be lacking, they basically walked over to the ethics team. So what's the point of ethics team at that point? And that's why you essentially want to have the gatekeepers aligning on those values that's written in the wiki, and everybody's responsible for that. And
those who make decisions, right?
Yeah. Not necessarily about the product, but whether it goes out or not.
But even better about the product, because you want to make sure that these values are propagated to those who are actually developing the product, right?
Yes.
Not already at the end when it's like decision to release it or not, because it's kind of too late.
It is too late, but if you look at the long run, what happens is that if your stuff doesn't go out, you learn really fast how to get it out. And then you start to like, oh, I should read these values, I should align to these ones. And then you start to like reinforce it.
Okay.
But if that reinforcement is missing, the opposite happens. People are noting, oh, okay, I can get away with this one because this makes me look good. And then the whole thing collapses.
Is this true? I heard in Apple, just to bring this example of guardrails, in Apple pretty much, I heard, I don't know if it's true, when Steve Jobs was there, he was pretty much the main gatekeeper. And at the end of the day, something was on his table. Everything ended up on his table at the end. And he said, nope, we are not doing this. Yes, we're doing this. No, this is not good enough.
Yeah.
I heard he was the main gatekeeper for many of such decisions as the last one. And if the people screwed up down there, they had to really modify what they're doing just to pass that gatekeeper.
I don't know how Apple works. And on some level, I don't want to know, because they're kind of like a hero company that you don't really want to peek behind the curtains to see how it's actually done. So I don't dare to comment. I've heard stories, but I don't know what is true or not. In many other companies, it usually doesn't go that high up, but there is some level of somebody who's responsible enough to check it out.
Okay, yeah. So let's say how high it can go. An example would be you have a 200 plus people company, or even 100 plus. Let's imagine you have a position called head of product, who is responsible for the whole product. Of course, they would collaborate with chief designer like you, but you would want to align with the head of product on the design principles, right? You would want to align very well on that, have it written down. And then head of product could be this ultimate gatekeeper who says, for example, no, sorry, we are not releasing it. Or even better, again, to avoid that situation where actually you reject something, you would propagate these values down to the teams who actually do the work. Like that's ultimately the goal, right?
Yeah.
So that the teams know these values and principles.
And how that's structured, that's up to the company. Like, for example, if you have a structure where you have different stakeholders able to have veto rights or whatnot, that's also possible, but it depends on how company wants to handle it. Point being that, okay, there is some either individual or somebody who's basically looking after it, and nothing goes through that if they feel like it's breaking ethical codes or what have you.
We talked a lot about like strategic things about UX, right? Like how would you even decide on the direction? It's based sometimes on metrics, values, principles, things like that. Do you want to still, like, over the next 10 minutes, we still have some time to discuss on more, I would even say like tactical level, but like how to make a good UX in a product. And again, we talked about strategic things about it, right? And as always, the answer is it depends. But what are some of the tactical things designers and engineers and the whole team can be aware of to make more probable good UX decisions when they are building product?
Working together. Like
Working together.
ultimately, like what always kills is handovers. When you are transferring information to another set of people, whether those are in the same profession or not, it doesn't really matter, and that's always tricky. So the more you can basically reduce that, the easier it is. And well, working together helps a lot too. Like Node, well, I guess it could be possible, but in practical sense, design rarely tries to cover every single situation because that's costly time-wise and oftentimes really hard. Like for example, error situation, who knows what's going to happen. So it is far more practical to work together on these things. Many companies that I've been to don't really do that. They often have some sort of a waterfall if you look at the bigger scale of things. That okay, you have like problem description, perhaps some research, then you have some design, then it goes to implementation and whatnot.
And never the second iteration, right? It's always like one iteration, one to one, from start to bottom. And then, well, next iteration will come when it's already handed over to users. They complain, and then you start over.
And surprise, surprise, those guys who are basically working on it already know that, okay, this is going to fail here and there. But they're just not doing anything about it because there's a deadline and, hey, it needs to go up the chain. So the more you can break it down, the easier it is. Like,
How would you say the understanding of the domain itself and the product, I believe it's paramount, right, for the good UX, or the actual understanding?
How do you define the domain?
Yeah, let's say you're building a product in some domain. Let's say we talked about baby care applications or something. Would you say it's paramount for the team to learn and understand more about the domain and this problem space, either from domain experts in the team or talking to customers? And maybe my question is, how should the team extract such information about product, especially if it's like semi-known to them or like not fully known? I guess what I'm also leaning towards is to understand, or maybe you can comment, how the team can exercise things like doing user interviews, or how would they extract kind of reality? How would they extract the actual problems that users face?
Again, multifaceted question that depends on the situation. But there's also like major difference on how most companies operate and how I believe they should operate.
Let's talk about how you believe as well they should operate.
And that comes back to what we were talking about, the prototyping. Like, let's imagine that we have a small team. We have a lead designer, we have a lead engineer, we have a user researcher, and perhaps a PM, depending on various things. Those start to formulate a hypothesis and early prototypes. If you're in a consumer space, we can pretty easily ask people around. At most, we need to do some screening, but it's usually doable. And then you are basically collecting the information into those people already. You really don't really have that problem anymore because you're working on together on most of the things. And then if you have a larger design team, sure enough, you can include more people to some extent, but at least those leads can then take it to the teams themselves if the team is bigger. And that's how you avoid most of it. Or putting it in a more positive perspective, that's how you basically work around the information gap.
Again, by working together, getting fast feedback loops, also externally with users.
And often helps by doing well, it's kind of like part of the process, but that's going to highlight that doing the debrief together. Like once you have
debrief of when you got some feedback from users?
Like for example, let's say a user researcher has done 20 different interviews. We be part in half of those. Let's collect together and like understand how we are interpreting that feedback. A lot of stuff can happen in those interviews and people are interpreting them in different ways. So having some like debriefs where people are kind of aligning themselves and what actually happened.
And same can happen in B2B context, right? I just remember how you were conducting some of the interviews with some of our customers in Pactum. And I remember we had debriefs afterwards. And it was very useful because, we shared, we again kind of, reflected on the whole interview, how it went. shared our own understandings.
Yes.
And,
and people are paying attention to different things. Like somebody might look at
Yes.
body language. One is basically conducting the interview. So depending on the personality, they may not be taking full notes because it's just interacting with them and so forth. So it's highly important.
Yeah. Good point. And so again, going back to my question of this more tactical decisions over UX, I guess, I don't know, I guess, I want the user, maybe audience to understand, right? Maybe the expectation was, oh, we have a podcast on design and we're going to talk about whether the button should be red or blue, or what should be the alignment, should it be in the center, in the left or right? But at the end of the day, the truth is that it depends. It depends on the context, and only you know, and you make these decisions in the context of learning about your customers, learning about, having this shared understanding in the team, making quick hypotheses and learnings. And I think, but I'm personally satisfied with these answers because I think this is true. This is the reality. This is how actually it works in companies, right? But I want to ask you now, maybe to wrap up the discussion, how would you advise people to become better at UX or design in terms of learning about it? Maybe you read some books that you think are really good, or some resources that again help you to wrap your hand around how to reason about UX. Can you give some advice on follow-up resources that people can check themselves or that affected you in some way?
This is somewhat old and a little bit abstract, but especially in the 90s, the good basis is indeed the human-computer interaction. Nielsen Norman Group has published many of those papers, especially Design of Everyday Things is a good starter.
That's a book, right?
Yeah,
Design of Everyday Things.
Yeah. My heavy influence comes also from Bill Buxton. He has various different publications. I can't remember them offhand, but he's been pretty active on the front.
Does he have a book as well, or some or only research papers?
I think, yes, he has a book. I can't remember the name, but there was some talks about how to design for alpine environments and avalanches and whatnot. Long background, so he's a good read. But I do kind of believe that trying to expand on empathy and trying to do things is far greater value than reading the books. Because the books don't really say how to take things into practice or how does it actually works. And that I believe you only get by doing, learning and making the mistakes. So some way of doing those. But also getting inspiration from elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think exactly. I think the books are good for inspiration and then reflecting some of the ideas from the books in your own work. But eventually you internalize the knowledge by maybe taking some of this inspiration or what you read in the books, trying it out in your work or some ideas, and then learning and seeing how did it work out in the context.
Yeah, and I'm really believing it's more about the mindset than actual
some
skills.
Pieces of knowledge.
Yeah, and even if you have the knowledge, if your mindset is not right, you're going to doing the right thing anyway. And then again, if you have the mindset, then you can pull out almost anything.
Yes.
For example, I was reading a book about Kyudo, Japanese archery, from one of the oldest schools that there are in Japan, still existence, Ogasawara Ryu. And they had a base, as much as it's about archery, they are pretty much the school that does etiquette, and how to train the emperors and others to behave correctly. And one of their saying was, do the expected as expected. And if you think about our environment in Pactum, and when we go to the clients and show our AI stuff, that's precisely what we should be doing. In a way, that could be one of our principles. It's not, but it could be. And it comes from a totally different field.
Yeah, and I can even tell and say how, because again, I studied human-computer interaction as well when I just arrived to Tallinn. For me, what I really translated to engineering field was the concept of affordance. You probably know. And the affordance is, and I love the example that our professor gave to us. He said for example, you know, like the signs when you have doors and it says push or pull,
Yes.
right? And it's an affordance. If you, and sometimes I know in England actually that's the case. In some of the doors, if it's a only push, they will not have a handle, so you don't have to even make a choice,
Because
and you just know it's a push because there's no affordance, right, to pull. And I'm just saying this as, so pretty much you avoid people even thinking about the kind of wrong state. You just eliminate this decision making from them, and you guide them into making the right decision, intuitive decision. And honestly, the same applies in engineering. The concept of affordance is very well known even in software design, modeling, domain-driven design. When you, for example, when you design an API or any kind of API, public API or some, interfaces in your application, you want to make sure that you as engineer, you use this code in a way that will not introduce corrupted state, that you will always use it correctly and it will guide you to use it correctly.
Yeah.
And by the way, just to give an example on even hardcore examples of this, this is the main principle of Google's security library called Think.
Yeah.
Because where most of the security issues come in or problems in the company is when they misuse the library or when they misuse some configuration, security configuration. This is where security holes come in.
Yeah.
And what their library did, for example, they really made an API and the design of the package in such a way that it's impossible to use it incorrectly. Literally, you'll have compile time errors if you use it incorrectly. And they designed it in a way that forces you pretty much, guide you to make the right choices and make it as impossible as possible, as impossible or nearly impossible to make the wrong choice.
Yeah.
And this is what I got personally from the interaction design and human-computer interaction. And this is again about sharing the fields and the inspirations from the fields.
Yes, and that's a good principle that seems to work more or less. The reference, by the way, comes from the earlier book, Design of Everyday Things, I believe.
Yeah, by Norman.
So it is on high level, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any things you want to close with, Janne?
I think I'm mostly good. Like always, I'm hoping to have the collaboration because it just makes everybody's life easier to work together, and hopefully we can foster that even more.
What do you think? I want to actually close with an interesting topic. Maybe we will not explore it in depth, but this is more like maybe for round 2 of our discussion. But how do you see design and UX design, interaction design evolving in the next 10 years? And why I'm asking this, because, for example, even with LLM technologies, right, and us declaratively now in a human language being able to express some things, and AI giving you immediate output of something that it generated, it already affects feedback loops in some way. For example, Figma is already embedding AI into their products so that you can describe some things in a human language. It will give you output. Again, not only Figma, but ChatGPT, Cloud, etc. What do you think about it? How it will affect the design industry, as in an industry as a whole, in the next 5 years even? 10 years is even maybe too much to say, but in the next 5 years, let's say.
You're touching, again, multiple interesting topics, and for the sake of time, perhaps we leave much of that.
For exactly.
I'd love to lament of the state of the design industry to some extent, due to fragmentation that has happened over the years, and some of the new programs that the schools are running, which to some extent devalue design and lower the bar. But let's not go there now. Considering more on the AI, I don't believe that we will get the UIs where we have prompts as a major way of interacting with the products.
Yes.
They may be part of it, but not the main part of it. So I don't think the design per se changes too much. What will change, though, is that designers need to develop ways of understanding what is possible. Previously, it was pretty easy to understand that if you have a button, then something can happen with the button, and it's like predicted output that comes out of it, whatever it is. Now, I believe that for the many of the designers, that the AI is more like a black box. That you can't really know that what is magical and dreamy and what is actual reality with the AI. So us as designers need better ways of understanding what we can do and what we cannot do.
In the realm of the product capabilities.
Yes.
But how do you feel the LLMs and AI will affect your own design work? That's also the question I'm curious about. Like, do you think it will affect your work, how you work, and actually generate design ideas?
For example, in the current states, LLMs are already in a broader sense, the LLMs are pretty good at creating ideas. Now, like you can ask them to like mock up interfaces, give you mood boards, whatnot, and that helps a lot.
Okay, and you think this will be leveraged even more in the upcoming 5 years?
Probably, I wouldn't see why not. How much I can't say, but it's already happening. So probably that they can break down problems far easier. How do you create copy texts? How do you find good practices in the industry?
Have you heard of the application, for example, which really helps with front-end prototyping for engineers, v0.dev?
No.
I discussed it with Carl in the...
I do know Visio, but...
Sorry?
I do remember Visio from days back, but I haven't...
No, it's a V0. It's the website name is called v0.dev. And it's developed by Vercel. I don't know if you know the company Vercel.
Yeah.
But I'm going to send you also the link in our Slack. But the idea is that pretty much it generates UI, like actually code, front-end code with UI, with simple text prompts.
Yeah.
And it's useful for just prototyping phase, right, where you're just playing with ideas around. But do you believe that this will only grow, this usage and leverage of prompts to generate some ideas on UI level, UX level?
Definitely.
And pretty much industry has to leverage that and learn how to use it and utilize it, right?
Yeah. It depends again on the cases and what you are doing, but oftentimes actually creating the UI doesn't take that long. So having AI to help you out on laying things out is limited usefulness. I'm not saying it's useless, but you're getting some efficiencies, but in the grand scheme of things, you are spending your time elsewhere anyway, so it's not a big deal. Also, it doesn't like help you to solve the business problems or what the thing should actually accomplish.
Yeah. Here, this is where you need human in the loop.
Yeah. For now.
For now. Yes.
And AI often has a specific style that you want to get rid of.
Yeah.
But first of all, those can get better. You get a lot of ideas. And then we have a huge group of potential non-users. Like, why do you need designers? What if you would basically just describe, okay, create this kind of a UI and it's not high importance of UI. Perhaps it's just good. Perhaps you can just kill my job and just do the website automatically.
But I think, would you agree that you as a designer, as long as you understand the value that you bring to the company, you don't feel threatened by these AI applications because you know that you can give unique value to the company by aligning the values of the company and like propagating these principles, and this is something that LLMs cannot replace right now. So you pretty much see yourself as a heavy user of these tools as they grow, but it's not going to replace your job, right? Because you have a pretty good understanding how you give value to the company.
In my personal case, yes. That's where also the principles come in. Like if I would be actually saying, okay, the button needs to be there, I would feel threatened. But if you are talking about larger concepts and keeping everything aligned, no.
Yes. So pretty much this is maybe the call to some designers or UX people is to keep the big picture in mind. Right?
Yeah.
What are you trying to, which value you're trying to bring to the company?
Yeah.
And working from there.
Yeah, like ultimately we could argue that the placement of the buttons doesn't really, in the end, matter that much.
Yeah.
Like most likely people figure it out. But if the big picture is missing, then it's pointless anyway.
By the way, same parallel for engineers, not feeling threatened, but it's only possible because when you feel where do you actually bring value as engineer, and mostly you bring value as engineer by solving problems.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to keep the business context in mind, like what are we trying to achieve? And then align all engineering decisions to that. And AI and LLMs, as they develop, great, I'm going to use them.
Yeah.
I'm going to use them to speed up my feedback loops or to speed up my work. But I still know the kind of larger context where I bring value.
Yeah.
And I think this is...
And partially, I think graphics industry is a better example where it's purely graphical. I would imagine that there things start to get a little bit muddier. In the high end, no, you are not threatened because everybody wants to have a custom-made stuff from good people anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
In the low end, they wouldn't be buying design services anyway, so you are not threatened. But in the middle, it might get nasty.
Yeah, I think it's just a good topic to reflect on, kind of looking into the future and for audience to reflect on this question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Janne. It was a pleasure.
It was indeed.
We are just in time before the next meeting happens here in this room.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you on the
Likewise. Happy to talk to you again.
Thanks, Janne.